Get out of this house. You're no daughter of mine. You're a disease.
The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air of our small kitchen, thick and oily like smoke from a grease fire. They weren't from a movie. They weren't a nightmare. They were real, each syllable a perfectly shaped shard of ice. And they had just been hurled at me by my own father, James Carter. The memory was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Me, a giggling 5-year-old, perched on his broad shoulders in the frozen food aisle of the supermarket. His large, warm hands were clamped around my ankles, steadying me as I reached with my chubby fingers for a pint of vanilla bean ice cream. His laugh, a deep, rumbling sound that made his whole body shake, was the safest sound in the world. Got it, Em? You got it, he cheered. Another memory just as vivid unspooled in the deafening silence. Me at 12. Sitting on a sun-drenched dock by Miller's Pond, the summer air thick with the buzz of dragonflies. He sat beside me for what must have been 2 hours. His callous fingers patiently guiding my clumsy ones, teaching me the intricate, frustrating art of the fisherman's knot. See? Over, under, around, and through. You can't rush it. You gotta have patience. You gotta respect the line. Patience. Respect. Now that same man was staring at me as if I were something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe. His face, usually tanned and creased with smile lines, was a blotchy, furious red. His eyes, the same warm brown as mine, were cold and hard as river stones. All of this entire detonation of my life, was because he now knew a single, simple fact about me. He knew I loved a girl. I have no idea how long I stood there, frozen on the worn linoleum of the kitchen where I grew up. This room had been the nucleus of my life. Its walls had absorbed the scent of 100 batches of Mom's Christmas gingerbread cookies, the sound of my laughter, the frustrated sighs over my 6th grade algebra homework at the oak table. Now it felt like a hostile alien space, a sterile interrogation room, the cream-colored refrigerator, a museum of my childhood, adorned with a photo of me in a lopsided angel costume and a gold star-covered report card, now only offered a distorted reflection of a 17-year-old girl who looked like a stranger. A girl who was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. A girl whose breath was a trapped, panicked bird in her throat. A girl whose hands were clenched into fists so tight that her short, bitten nails were digging crescent-shaped wounds into her palms, a single, tiny bead of blood welling up on her left hand. The acrid smell of burnt coffee from the pot my father had left on the hot plate for too long stung my nostrils. It was a funeral smell. It mingled with the only other sound in the room, the loud, indifferent tick-tock of the kitschy cat clock on the wall, its tail swinging back and forth, marking the seconds of my life's demolition. It all started with a text message. Such a small thing. A handful of innocent words that I never in a million years thought could act as the detonator for the bomb that was my family. I miss you. Miss the way you hug me from behind when you think I'm not looking. With you, I don't have to pretend anymore. The text was from Grace. Grace, with her riot of untamable curly brown hair, her sprinkle of freckles across her nose, and a lopsided smile that had the power to short-circuit my entire nervous system. I'd left my phone on the breakfast table that morning after she texted. The screen still lit up. I hadn't locked it. Why would I? In my own home, I had nothing to hide. That was my fatal mistake. I had mistaken my home for a safe house. My mother, a woman whose love was often expressed through a meticulous, invasive form of tidiness, had a habit of organizing everything. My school bag, my desk drawers, the pockets of my jeans in the laundry. Nothing was private. Everything was subject to her inspection. So of course she picked up the phone. I wasn't there for the initial discovery. I was at a study group session, blissfully unaware, laughing with friends about a stupid meme. I walked through the front door an hour later, humming, feeling light and accomplished. The first thing I saw was her face. It wasn't anger. Anger I could have handled. Anger is an emotion that still involves a connection, a relationship. No, this was far worse. This was revulsion. It was the look you'd give a roach scuttling across your clean floor. She looked at me as if she just discovered that a parasite, a creature of profound wrongness, had been living inside the shell of her daughter for 17 years. She took a half step back as I entered the kitchen, her body language a physical recoil. Her hand was still clutching my phone, her knuckles white, as if she were afraid that if she touched me, my sickness would be contagious. There was no explanation, no frantic, tearful question of, "Emily, what does this mean?" Not even the slightest tremor in the voice of the woman who had sung, "You Are My Sunshine," to me every single night until I was 10. The woman who held me and cried with me when our old golden retriever, Rusty, had to be put down. There was only a silence that was louder than any scream, a vacuum of sound and warmth. It was in that silence that I ceased to be Emily. I was no longer the daughter she had raised and loved. I wasn't it. A thing. A dirty secret that had been exposed. Something that did not, and should not, exist. My father came home 20 minutes later. I was still standing in the kitchen, paralyzed, while my mother stood by the sink, refusing to look at me, scrubbing a perfectly clean pot with furious circular motions. I don't know what she said to him when he walked in. Maybe she just showed him the phone. Maybe she used the same word he would later use. Disease. All I know is that when he stormed into the kitchen, his face was a mask of thunderous rage. He didn't ask me for my side. He didn't ask if it was a joke. He didn't give me the dignity of a conversation. He just stopped a few feet from me, his presence sucking all the air out of the room, and he opened his mouth. The words that came out weren't just words. They were stones. They were fists. Get out of this house. You're no daughter of mine. You're a disease. Then as I stood there swaying, my world tilting on its axis, he delivered the final, fatal blow. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. You know what? It would have been easier to forgive you if you were dead. A dead daughter is a tragedy. This is a humiliation. That sentence was a perfectly honed razor. It slid between my ribs, straight into my heart, and twisted. It was a wound that produced no blood, but the pain was so immense, so absolute, that my vision tunneled and my knees unlocked. I think I would have fallen if not for the counter I gripped behind me. I risked a glance at my mother, a desperate, primal appeal from a child to her creator. Please, say something. Stop him. Help me. But she just turned her face away, toward the window that overlooked the backyard where I used to play. Her hand, free from the pot, was now gripping the beveled edge of the granite countertop, her nails making a faint scratching sound on the polished surface. Her silence wasn't just complicity, it was a verdict. She was the judge who refused to even look at the condemned. Her quiet was more brutal, more damning, than my father's hate-filled shouts. It was the final nail. I don't remember the mechanics of leaving. My brain had shut down all non-essential functions. It was pure, animal instinct. Flee. I stumbled to my room, my movements clumsy and robotic. I grabbed my school backpack. I shoved in a pair of jeans, a few t-shirts, a hoodie. My hands found my old, spiral-bound journal, the one filled with pages and pages of angsty, terrible, wonderful poems about grace, and stuffed it in. My dying phone. I didn't take any of the pictures from my corkboard. I didn't take the stuffed bear I'd had since I was 3. Those things belonged to a girl who no longer existed. I don't remember if I shut the front door behind me. I hope I slammed it. I hope a picture fell off the wall. The one thing I do remember with perfect chilling clarity is the rain. It started the moment I stepped outside. Not a gentle drizzle, but a cold, punishing downpour. The sky opened up, a furious, gray witness to my exile. The drops were like thousands of tiny, icy needles, stabbing at my face and arms as I walked, numb, through the rusted iron gate of my home. For the very last time. My canvas Converse, already worn and full of holes, were soaked through within a minute. Mud and grime splattered my ankles. I walked. I just walked. There was no destination in my mind, no plan. Not even a coherent thought. There was only a roaring static between my ears and the singular, primal command, away. I couldn't stay. I couldn't turn back. I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's disgusted eyes or my father's voice. A voice that had once read me bedtime stories and now echoed in my head, branding me with one word. Disease. 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 I walked for what felt like hours, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked curtain of my own tears. I eventually found myself drawn to the grim, flickering lights of the downtown bus station. It was a nexus of desperation, smelling of wet concrete, diesel fumes, and stale desperation. I huddled on a hard, cold plastic bench, pulling my thin hoodie tighter around me. I was an island of misery in a sea of strangers. A man in a grease-stained cap was sleeping beside me, his mouth open, a rattling snore escaping with each breath. Across the way, a young mother, who couldn't have been much older than me, rocked a crying baby, her own face a mask of bone-deep exhaustion. A well-dressed couple, probably heading home to the suburbs, walked past me. The woman in a crisp trench coat caught sight of me, my soaked clothes, my tear-stained face, my dirty shoes. She visibly recoiled, pulling her husband closer, and I heard her mutter, loud enough for me to hear, God, look at that. What is wrong with kids these days? Probably on drugs. Her husband nodded, his gaze lingering on me with undisguised contempt before he hurried her along. The casual cruelty of it, the easy judgment from a complete stranger, was like salt in my gaping wound. My father's words weren't just his own. They were a reflection of a world that would see me, at my most broken, and decide I was the problem. I pulled my backpack onto my lap, hugging it to my chest as if it were the only thing left in the world that was truly mine. My eyes were raw and gritty, but the tears had finally stopped. My heart felt like a tangled knot of barbed wire. Then a soft voice cut through my haze. You okay, child? I looked up. An older black woman sat down on the bench next to me. She had kind, weary eyes that seemed to see right through my defenses. She was holding a worn copy of a book, For a fleeting second, I wanted to shatter, to pour out the entire ugly story to this perfect stranger. But I couldn't. The capacity for trust had been surgically removed from me just hours before. "I'm fine," I mumbled, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. She just nodded slowly, a deep sadness in her gaze. "The world can be a cold place," she said, not to me but to the air. "But the sun always comes up. You remember that." She offered me a small, wrapped granola bar from her purse. I just stared at her hand until she gently placed it on the bench between us and turned back to her book. I didn't eat it. I couldn't. I pulled out my worn wallet and counted the crumpled bills inside. $67.34. The sum total of my worldly possessions. Money saved from my weekend job at the Daily Grind coffee shop. I walked to the ticket counter, my legs feeling like lead, and looked at the board of destinations. New York, Chicago, Denver. My eyes landed on one name, Los Angeles. I'd only ever seen it in movies. A sun-bleached fantasy land of palm trees and possibilities. In those movies, it was a place where people like me, the outcasts, the dreamers, the ones who didn't fit, could go and find their tribe, where they could hold hands on the street and no one would throw stones, literal or verbal. It was a lie, I knew. A Hollywood fabrication. But it was the only lie I had left to cling to. "One way to Los Angeles," I said to the bored-looking man behind the glass. The bus ride was 34 hours of purgatory. I got a window seat and pressed my forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. I watched my hometown recede until it was just another smear of light in the darkness. I didn't sleep, not really. I drifted in and out of a state of exhausted delirium, my father's words playing on a torturous loop in my head. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was chilled to the bone in the bus's overly aggressive air conditioning. But I didn't complain. Complaining meant you still believed someone was listening. I was done with that belief. At a rest stop somewhere in the vast, empty plains of Arizona, I watched a family, a mom, a dad, a daughter about my age, laughing as they shared a bag of fries. The dad put his arm around his daughter and squeezed her shoulder. A simple, thoughtless gesture of affection. The sight of it caused a pain so sharp and so profound in my chest that I had to stumble back onto the bus, my eyes burning, before I completely fell apart in the middle of a gas station parking lot. The world outside the window was a blur of endless highways, sun-scorched landscapes, and small, forgotten towns that seemed to be slowly crumbling back into the dust. I kept asking myself the same question, over and over. Is there a place for me anywhere? Do I belong on this planet? Or am I just a ghost now, untethered, with no home and no people? Los Angeles did not greet me with open arms. It greeted me with a thick yellow haze of smog that hung over the city like a dirty blanket. The sun was a hot, white disk in the sky. But its heat was aggressive, not warming. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, and something vaguely like rotting garbage, all overlaid with the faint, salty tang of the distant ocean. The bus station was even bigger and more chaotic than the one I'd left. It was a whirlpool of noise and motion and people whose faces were hard and closed off. I walked out into the city. Into the overwhelming reality of it. I walked for hours, for miles, my new blister screaming with every step. My Hollywood fantasy evaporated in the harsh sunlight. This wasn't a city of dreams. It was a city of concrete and desperation, of jarringly rich neighborhoods right next to sprawling encampments of the homeless. Eventually, my legs gave out. I found a slightly sheltered spot in the doorway of a long-since-closed bakery. The wooden sign, its paint peeled and faded, hung crookedly, announcing the sweet life. The irony was a bitter pill. I slid down the grimy tag wall, pulling my knees to my chest, clutching my backpack as if it were a shield. And then, for the first time since that initial violent explosion of grief in my own kitchen, I broke. I cried. It wasn't the quiet, dignified crying of movie heroines. It was an ugly, primal, full-body affair. Huge, gulping sobs tore out of me. Raw and ragged. It felt as if my entire chest cavity were filled with nothing but unshed tears. And if I didn't get them out, I would literally drown in all the things that had been left unsaid. All the pain I had been holding in. I cried for the little girl who believed that a parent's love was a law of nature, as reliable as gravity. I cried for the house that was no longer a home. For the gingerbread cookies I would never bake with my mother again. I cried for the quiet, stolen evenings in the library with Grace, our shoulders touching, whispering about the future. A future that I had naively believed was mine to claim. I cried for Grace, wondering if her parents were looking at her with that same horrifying disgust. And I cried because I knew, with the bone-deep absolute certainty of the truly abandoned, that no one was coming. There would be no frantic phone calls. No tearful reunions. No one was going to swoop in and rescue me. No one was going to pick me up off this filthy sidewalk, hold me and whisper in a trembling voice, "Emily, my child, please come home." There was no one. In that moment, baptized in the grime of a city that didn't know I existed and the salt of my own tears, I understood a truth that was both terrifying and In a strange way, liberating. From this second forward, I was completely, utterly on my own. Alone with hands that felt permanently cold, a heart that felt like a shattered plate, and a long dark road ahead that I was in no way prepared to walk. But I would walk it, even if it hurt, even if I was scared, even if I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. I would walk it, because I refused to grant my father his wish. I refused to die. Not out of spite, but out of a tiny, flickering ember of defiance deep inside me. An ember that whispered, I deserve to live. I deserve to love. I deserve to be me. I woke to a throbbing headache and the unfamiliar sensation of a thin, lumpy mattress beneath me. For a disoriented second, I thought I was in my own bed. That the whole thing had been a spectacularly awful nightmare. But my room didn't smell of cheap coffee and damp old wood. My room didn't have peeling paint on the walls or a grimy window that the sun could barely penetrate. The murmuring voices of strangers from a nearby kitchen, and the clatter of silverware jolted me back to reality. This wasn't my home. This was a youth shelter. The place a woman named Monica had brought me to late last night. She'd found me huddled in that bakery doorway, shivering and semi-delirious from exhaustion and dehydration. I barely remembered her kind face, just her calm, steady voice cutting through my fog. You're safe now. Come with me. I sat up, my arms protectively wrapped around my backpack. It was my only possession, a tangible link to the life that had been violently amputated. I pulled out my journal. The last entry scrawled in a shaky, barely legible hand before I'd finally succumbed to sleep on the street, read, Today, someone looked at me and didn't see trash. Someone gave me soup. Someone called me by my name. My throat tightened. I wanted to write more, to describe Monica's eyes. They were brown and tired, but they held no judgment, no fear. But how do you write about being saved by a stranger, when you've just learned that the people who are supposed to love you most can be the most dangerous? How do you start to trust again when the very concept of trust has been shattered? Monica appeared at the doorway of the large, dormitory-style room. She was wearing a faded blue hoodie. Her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked tired, but she gave me a small, gentle smile. You're up, Emily, she said. Her voice was deep and warm. And the simple act of her remembering and using my name felt like a bomb on a raw wound. I just nodded, unable to meet her gaze. I was afraid that if I looked into her kind eyes, the dam would break again, and I didn't think I had any tears left. Breakfast is on, she said, gesturing with her coffee mug toward the kitchen. Toast and an apple. Then I'll give you the tour. There are rules here, but they're simple. Respect the place, respect the people, and clean up after yourself. I nodded again and forced myself to my feet. The slice of toast was dry and the apple was a little mealy, but I ate every bite slowly, methodically. It was fuel. It was survival. Monica sat across from me at the large, scarred wooden table, sipping her coffee. She didn't pepper me with questions. She didn't ask where I was from, who my parents were, or why a 17-year-old girl was alone in Los Angeles with bleeding heels and the eyes of a ghost. Instead, she just told me about the shelter. It was an old, donated house run on a shoestring budget by a handful of volunteers. It was a temporary refuge for homeless and runaway youth. We call it the Haven, she said. Here you can stay for a bit. Get on your feet. We can help with getting your GED, finding a job, getting you connected with resources. No one's gonna make you tell your story, she added, her gaze steady and serious. But my door is always open. I'm here to listen when you're ready. I wasn't ready. It wasn't that I didn't trust her exactly. It was that I didn't know how to give voice to the monstrous thing that had happened. How do you explain that your father, the man who taught you how to ride a bike, now called you a disease? How do you describe your mother, the woman who kissed your scraped knees, turning her back on you as if you were a stain she couldn't scrub out? And how do you talk about Grace, the beautiful, wonderful girl whose name was now inextricably linked to the destruction of your entire world? The words were trapped inside me, a toxic, indigestible lump. After breakfast, Monica showed me around. The Haven was old and worn, but it was clean. The walls were painted a pale, calming blue, though the paint was peeling in places. The main common room had a few mismatched, sagging couches, an ancient boxy TV, and a bookshelf overflowing with dog-eared paperbacks. Taped to the wall was a whiteboard with the daily chore rota written in colored marker: dish duty, sweep floors, laundry, prep dinner. Everyone pulls their weight here, Monica explained. Not as payment, but because this is a community. Doing your part helps you feel like you belong to it. Belong. The word felt foreign. I hadn't felt like I belonged anywhere, not even in my own home, for a very long time. But I just nodded. All I wanted was a roof over my head. A place where I didn't have to sleep with one eye open, terrified of having my backpack stolen. My first assigned chore was dish duty. The simple, mindless task was a blessing. It kept my hands busy and my mind blessedly blank, drowning out the echo of my father's voice. The hot water soothed my raw hands and the rhythmic clatter of plates and bowls was a steady, almost comforting sound. Another girl, maybe a few years older than me, with a shock of electric blue hair and a row of silver rings in her ear, was drawing next to me. New meat? She asked without looking up, her voice flat. I mumbled a yes. Don't worry, she said, her tone softening slightly. Everyone here thought they were gonna die their first day. You get used to the vibe. Her name was Jade. She told me in a blunt, matter-of-fact way that she'd been living under a freeway overpass on Skid Row for 6 months before Monica found her. She'd survived by shoplifting and learning which dumpsters the bakeries used. Monica's the real deal, Jade said, tossing a clean plate onto the stack with a clatter. She's the kind of person who makes you want to believe the world isn't a complete and total dumpster fire. She let out a short, cynical laugh. Even when you know damn well it is. A tiny flicker of something, not quite hope but a less intense form of dread, ignited in my chest. Maybe Jade was right. Maybe Monica was a reason not to give up entirely. But I was afraid of hope. Hope, I was learning, was a double-edged sword. It could lift you up, but it made the fall so much harder when it was inevitably kicked out from under you. The days began to blur into a strange, monotonous rhythm. Chores. Simple meals of pasta or peanut butter sandwiches. Enrolling in a local GED program Monica found for me. And sleeping on the lumpy mattress in the crowded room. The sounds of other people's troubled sleep a constant, low hum around me. Every night, I wrote in my journal. I wrote about the small things, the smell of Monica's coffee. The way Jade always sang off-key to the classic rock station in the kitchen, the way the afternoon light hit the dusty floor. And I wrote about the big things. The gnawing ache in my chest when I let myself think about my mother, the white-hot rage that flared whenever I thought of my father, and Grace. Always Grace. I had no idea if she was okay. If she even knew where I was, if she still thought of me. My phone had been a dead brick in the bottom of my bag for weeks. It was a relic from a buried life. One evening, I was wiping down the glass on the front door of the common room when I heard a hesitant voice behind me. Emily? The sound of my name in that particular voice sent an electric jolt through my entire body. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned around slowly, my cleaning rag still in my hand. It was Grace. She was standing in the entryway, looking small and lost. She was wearing the gray hoodie I'd given her for her birthday. Her hair was shorter, her face was thinner. And her eyes were red and puffy as if she'd been crying for weeks. In her hands, she was clutching a paper bag from a donut shop like it was a life preserver. Emily, she whispered again. Her voice cracking on my name. It's really you. My mind went blank. Every emotion hit me at once. I wanted to run and wrap my arms around her and sob until I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream at her, to demand to know where she'd been. Why she hadn't answered my frantic, desperate calls from payphones in those first few days. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, impossible reality of her being here. Grace took a shaky step forward, placing the bag of donuts on a nearby table. She pulled out her own phone and showed me the screen. It was a picture of us from months ago, squeezed together in a booth at the school library, grinning like idiots, a copy of The Catcher in the Rye between us. Do you remember? She asked, her voice thick with tears. I nodded, unable to speak. How could I forget? That was the day I had first dared to hold her hand under the table. My heart pounding so loud I was sure the whole library could hear it. It was the first time in my life I had felt completely, perfectly myself. Her story came tumbling out in a rush. After my parents discovered our text, they had immediately called hers. The reaction had been a carbon copy of my own experience. Disgust. Shame. Accusations. They'd called her dirty, unnatural. They'd taken her phone, forbidden her from leaving the house except for school, and had started the process of transferring her to a different, more wholesome school across town. I thought I was never going to see you again, she sobbed, the words crumbling. I tried to find you. I called your house and your dad. He said some horrible things. He said you were gone. Then a friend of a friend who volunteers here mentioned a new girl, named Emily. I didn't let myself believe it, but I had to come and see. And then the paralysis broke. And we were clinging to each other in the middle of that shabby common room, surrounded by the quiet, respectful gazes of the other broken kids who understood, without needing to be told, what a moment like this meant. I felt the warmth of her body, her frantic heartbeat against my chest, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I didn't feel utterly and completely alone in the universe. Part 4, The Reckoning. Grace became a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting my brutal new reality to the girl I used to be. She couldn't stay at the Haven. Her parents were watching her like a hawk, monitoring her every move, but she found ways to see me. She'd sneak out, telling her parents she was at the library, and we'd meet for an hour in the shelter's small, neglected backyard. We'd sit on a splinter picnic bench under a struggling, sun-bleached tree, and she'd bring me donuts or a dog-eared book she thought I'd like. We talked about small things. A new song on the radio, a stupid thing a teacher said, her elaborate plans for sneaking out. We carefully avoided the big things. We didn't talk about my parents or hers. We didn't talk about the words they'd used, the looks on their faces. The wounds were too fresh, too raw. Just being together was a quiet act of defiance, a confirmation that what we had was real, no matter how many people called it a disease. One sweltering afternoon, I was volunteering with a church group Monica had connected me with, serving food to the homeless on Skid Row. The sheer scale of the poverty was overwhelming. A city of tents and makeshift shelters sprawling for blocks. A little girl, no older than 10, with tangled hair and a torn t-shirt, tugged on my sleeve as I handed her a plate of stew. "Do you have a mom and dad?" she asked, her eyes wide and serious. The question caught me off guard. The automatic, reflexive answer was on the tip of my tongue. Yes. But the word felt like a lie. I looked down into her curious, innocent face. I said, the words feeling truer than anything I'd said in months. But now I'm choosing a new family. People who love me for who I am. She just nodded, accepting this as a perfectly reasonable answer, and went to sit on the curb to eat her stew. As I watched her go, I felt a small, tight knot in my chest loosen just a little bit. I was starting to define myself not by what had been taken from me, but by what I was choosing to build. But life in Los Angeles wasn't a neat, clean story of healing. It was messy and brutal. There were nights I'd lie awake on my thin mattress, listening to the wail of sirens in the distance, a sound that always made me feel profoundly alone and unsafe. There were days I'd catch my reflection in a shop window and not recognize the gaunt, haunted-looking girl staring back at me. The fear that I would always be a ghost, a shadow living on the margins, was a constant, chilling companion. The city's casual cruelty was a constant reminder of my father's verdict. One evening, walking back from my GED class, a drunk man stumbled out of a bar and blocked my path. He was big and he smelled of cheap whiskey and sweat. He looked me up and down, a predatory sneer on his face. He could smell my fear. "What are you looking at?" he slurred, stepping closer. "I know what you are. You're one of them dykes, ain't ya? I can always tell. You got that look." The slur, the same one my father had spit at me over the phone when Grace had tried to call, hit me with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted, the streetlights swam. It was the same hate, just in a different voice. I didn't answer. I just turned and ran. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tripped on a crack in the sidewalk, scraping my hands and knees, but scrambled back up and kept running. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until I couldn't hear his jeering laughter anymore. I collapsed in a dark, deserted alley, wrapping my arms around my knees and sobbed. The world wasn't safe. My father's house wasn't an anomaly. It was a microcosm. The hate was everywhere. Huddled in that alley, feeling smaller and more broken than ever, I thought about giving up. What was the point of fighting so hard just to survive in a world that despised you? But then, a series of images flashed through my mind. Monica's steady, compassionate eyes. Jade's cynical but fiercely loyal smirk. Grace's hand, warm and real, in mine. "You do not give up," a voice inside me. A voice that was starting to sound like my own insisted. "Not for them. For you." I forced myself to my feet and walked back to the haven. The pain in my scraped knees a dull echo of the deeper pain inside. I knew then that survival wasn't enough. I had to find a way to fight back. I started working at a grimy 24-hour diner, washing dishes and bussing tables on the graveyard shift. The pay was garbage, but it was mine. It was independence in the form of crumpled dollar bills. The first thing I bought was a new pair of sturdy boots. The second was a phone charger. When I plugged my old phone in, it sprang to life with a pathetic chime. There were dozens of notifications, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and one text message sent weeks ago from my mother. It was only 3 words. "Are you okay?" I stared at the message for what must have been an hour. The sheer breathtaking hypocrisy of it made me feel sick. "Are you okay? You who stood by and watched your husband call me a disease. You who let him throw me out into the night. You who betrayed me with your silence. You have the audacity to ask if I'm okay?" My thumbs flew across the screen, typing out a torrent of rage. "No, I'm not okay. I sleep in a room with 10 strangers. I was almost attacked on the street. I eat thanks to the charity of others. All because of you. How dare you ask me if I'm okay?" My finger hovered over the send button. I could feel the bitter satisfaction of landing that verbal punch. But then I stopped. What would it accomplish? It wouldn't make her understand. It would just be pouring more poison into a well that was already toxic. She wasn't asking because she was ready to listen. She was asking to absolve herself of guilt. Slowly, deliberately, I deleted the entire message. I didn't reply. I turned the phone off and put it back in my bag. Instead, I opened my journal. Today, I bought new boots. They aren't Converse. They aren't cute. But they are strong. And they are strong enough to keep me walking forward. As the months passed, a subtle shift began to happen. I started to feel like I wasn't just surviving, but actually living. I learned how to make surprisingly good chili with Jade, laughing at her terrible jokes. I learned to trust Monica, to talk to her about the suffocating weight of my grief, and to believe her when she said, "You are not what they called you, Emily. You are not what happened to you." And I learned to love Grace, not in the shadows, but in the stolen, sunlit moments we could carve out for ourselves, a fierce, defiant love that was our own private rebellion. One day, while organizing the chaotic bookshelf at the Haven, my fingers brushed against a thin, worn-out paperback. The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. I took it back to my bunk and read the entire thing in one sitting. I cried when I read it. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition. In Esperanza's story of wanting a house of her own, a space to be herself, I saw my own reflection. I saw a girl who wasn't just a victim, but someone who could use words to build her own escape. So I started to write. Not just the raw, messy entries in my journal, but more. I wrote short, sharp poems about the sound of sirens at night. About Jade's blue hair, about the little girl on Skid Row. I wrote about my father's hands, how they could be both gentle enough to teach a child to fish and cruel enough to cast her out. I was digging into the wound, but this time it felt like I was the surgeon, not the patient. On a whim, I sent one of my poems, titled "The House I'm Building," to a local literary zine that held a contest. I didn't expect anything. A month later, an email appeared in my inbox. My poem had been selected for publication. There was no money, but there was an invitation to read it at a public open mic night. The thought of it terrified me, but the thought of not doing it terrified me more. The open mic was held in a small, crowded coffee shop that smelled of espresso and nervous energy. When my name was called, my legs felt like they were made of concrete. I walked up to the small, makeshift stage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The microphone felt cold in my trembling hand. I looked out at the sea of shadowed faces, and then I saw them. Grace was in the front row, giving me a shaky, encouraging smile. Monica and Jade were sitting at a small table near the back, Monica with a proud, maternal look on her face, and Jade giving me a rare, genuine thumbs up. I took a deep breath, unfolded the crumpled piece of paper, and began to read. My voice cracked at first, but as I spoke my own words, the words I had bled onto the page, it grew stronger. The house they gave me had walls of glass, where love was a thing you had to pass a quiet inspection, a silent test. My heart was a bird held tight in a nest, but my song was wrong, a dissonant key. And they opened their hands and they set me free, free to fall, free to break on the stone, free to learn the hard truth of alone. So I'm building a new house, a different kind. From the wreckage and rubble they left behind, the foundation is made of a stranger's kind word, the frame is the truest song I have heard, the windows are open to let in the light. And the door has a lock I control day and night. My table is small, but the seats are for those whose love doesn't bend to the wind as it blows. The roof might still leak when the thunderstorms start, but it's built by my hands. It's a work of my art. It isn't a mansion of granite or praise. It's just a small shelter for the rest of my days. It's the house that I'm building inside of my chest, where I am the owner, the builder, the guest, where I am not broken, or sick, or a sin, just a girl with a hammer, and letting the light in. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was real. It was warm. Grace was crying and clapping the loudest. Walking off that stage, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in a year. I knew my journey wasn't over. The scars would always be a part of me. There would be more nights of doubt, more days where the world's hate felt like a physical weight. But for the first time, I felt like I had more than just boots to walk forward with. I had a voice. I had Grace. I had Monica and Jade, my messy, imperfect chosen family. And most importantly, I was finally, truly beginning to have myself. And that I was starting to realize was more than enough to keep building.